Paul talks to us very clearly about how to live in the community of our life. And in Romans chapter 13, he deals with this in a very direct way. And he uses, shall we say, the language of Christianity, the theology of Christianity, and the principles even drawn from God's covenantal law in the Old Testament about how to act and live with one another. And he reinforces those as we live and act in our normal daily lives in the communities we live in. In Romans 13, verse 8, we'll pick up. Owe nothing to anyone except that you love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that sounds great, but how do you really do that? Our culture here in North America has a very distorted definition of love, and when we look at that definition, it's weird. It's just strange stuff. And Paul has a tendency to read through a few centuries of, shall we say, linguistics to come up to where we're at, and he really nails it down here, especially when we read it even in the English language. But it's even deeper and richer when we go back into the Greek of the first century. He says that you owe nothing to no one. You're not to owe anything. And this has been literally interpreted many times as you have to live debt-free, or you should be living debt-free. And I personally think that is the best way to live. But that's not really what we're talking about here. I was raised in a parochial Christian school, and that particular school, when they read this verse, it says, well, you don't miss your payments. You can be in debt, but just make your payments on time. It's like, no, I don't really think that's what we're talking about here, especially when you read it in context. And he goes on to say, for this you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. What's he saying? He's saying, if you love somebody, it shows up in what you do, and that doesn't create a debt that needs to be forgiven. Okay? And that's what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness is letting a debt go. When someone does you harm, they create a need for revenge, a need for retaliation, a need to get even. And Paul's saying, if you don't owe anybody anything, they don't owe you anything, and you live right, there's no need for that. You won't need to be forgiven. You won't need to go, oh, I really messed up. And he dresses it in some very unique ways. He says, you shall not commit adultery. In other words, you'll not step out of your marriage into the wrong relationship with your neighbor. And bear in mind, we're not talking about your next door neighbor, though we could be. We're talking about anybody around you that you're affiliated with, that you associate with, that you interact with regularly. Those are your basic core of neighbors. It can be anybody in the world, but usually the problems stem within the group of people we're associated with. And I'm going to say this very clearly, including your church congregation. Okay, they're your neighbors too. And he says, don't commit adultery, don't step out of bounds sexually. He says, you shall not murder. And he says, don't hate it. That to murder is to hate here. Okay? When you wish someone was dead because you dislike them so much, you have murdered them. You have literally murdered them in your heart. And the sins of the heart almost outweigh the sins of the flesh. The consequences are a little different, but they're just about the same. And they're all sin in God's eyes. So he goes on to say, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, and you shall not covet. In other words, you're not going, I want what they got, and I'm going to go get it. And I think it even is more of a mental/spiritual thing where you see they've got a new car, I got to go get a new car. See, that's a covetous. You may not want their car, but you want to be even. It's kind of like we used to say, you keep up with the Joneses. That's not loving them. And you be who God wants you to be. And you don't have to worry about that. You don't create environments where they're wondering, what's wrong with them? They copy everything I do. You know? And there's Christians doing that because they live by the flesh. They live by their five senses, and they don't walk in the Spirit. And so therefore, they end up owing people, the debts of their works, and the debts of their evil thoughts, and the debts of their sins that they commit with or for or against their neighbors. There's a whole different depth to this that we don't see when we just look at it literally. And I heard a guy ask me one time, he said, well, do you interpret the Bible literally? Well, yes, when I can. And there are points when you have to. But there are points when you have to see things like this and you go, okay, that language may look literal, but he's not talking that way at all. That's important that we understand that. And it's important that we do not have any debts to be forgiven, that they do not have any debts to forgive us, that we live at peace with all men, as Paul says, as much as possible. When we do that, we don't commit adultery. When we do that, we don't steal, we don't covet. These are things that help us fulfill the law. And he sums it up and says, that's how you love your neighbor, by what you do. And I'm going to add a little bit to it by also what you don't do when it comes to evil, sin, and wickedness. Because we have a tendency to be led away by our sin. And so love is a doing thing. It's always a verb in a sentence. When we love something, it's the verb, it's the action word. And that's what's important. You can say I love you till the cows come home. That doesn't mean anything if you don't back it up. And so to love your neighbor as yourself is to walk in a purity with them so that there is no debt between you and them.